Okay, hello and good evening everyone, and welcome to the latest instalment in the Institute for Northern Studies public seminar series. It's lovely to see you all this evening. For those who don't know me, my name is Dr. Andrew Lind. I'm a lecturer here at INS, and it is my great pleasure to be chairing these sessions. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I've just got a couple very important but admittedly very boring technical points that I'd like to just very quickly make everyone aware of. The first is that tonight's session is being recorded and it will be available to watch after the fact on the INS YouTube channel. So if you can't get enough of it the first time around, you can go and rewatch it there. The other point I'd need to make everyone aware of is about questions to the speaker. So you are all welcome to submit questions at any point tonight, as we'll have a Q&A session after the speaker is finished. And to do so, please submit your questions via the chat function on your screen rather than the Q&A button. And when you submit those questions, can you just make sure that you send them to all panelists? And that just makes sure that we can all see them and we don't miss out on anything. Now, that's all the boring technical stuff. So on to the main reason you're all here tonight. I am thrilled to introduce our speaker this evening, Dr. Thomas Smallberg. Now, Dr. Smallberg is an associate professor at the University of Malmö, where he teaches on antiquity, medieval and early modern history, as well as cultural heritage. Thomas has published on a range of topics, specialising in noble culture and networks in medieval Sweden. But more recently, his work has focused on identity construction and how the past is being used within that framework in modern Sweden. And tonight, Thomas will be sharing some of his research with us in his paper, Shining a Light Over History, Vikarvet Antiquities Association and the Use of History in Bohuslän. Welcome, Thomas.
Well, thank you, Andrew. And first, before I start my slideshow for you, I would like to thank UHI and the Institute for Northern Studies, and especially you, Andrew, for inviting me to give this session, give this paper, and present to you my fairly burgeoning research on the Viking Age heritage in Sweden during the 19th and 20th century. So here we go, and we'll see if the technology functions. You should all be seeing the slide now. Shining a Light Over History, Vikarvet Antiquities Association and the Use of History in Bohuslän. Well, the 19th century and early 20th century was a period of constructed national identities throughout Europe. Nationalism and national romanticism was prevalent in many countries, not least the Scandinavian countries of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. However, this nationalism also carried transnational aspects. Particularly in Scandinavia, there was a sense of a common past, a shared heritage that had its roots in the Old Norse culture, which Orkney is well aware of, obviously, with the Vikings and the Sagas. And further, the political ideology of Scandinavism was prevalent in certain educated circles in these countries. Scandinavism being then the ideology that Sweden, Norway, and Denmark shared a cultural heritage, history, and other bonds. And this then should translate to common interest in the then present. However, there is an ambivalent sense to this in that Denmark and Norway had a long, difficult common history together. In fact, I've heard it referred to that Norway experienced the period from the Middle Ages and onwards as the long Danish night. And Sweden and Norway also, during the Napoleonic Wars and the aftermath, joined in a union from 1814, which also complicated the identities and the construction of the past. Further, Bohuslän is a coastal border province with a long and complex history. During various periods in time, both Norway, Sweden, and Denmark have all claimed the province as theirs. However, there's an irony in this, because now, when you read national histories of these countries, Bohuslän has a relatively small place in the history writing, which my project hopes to alleviate to some extent anyway. So this project then will focus on emotional nationalism, such as Scandinavism, by analyzing strategies of actors in a particular region of Sweden. And I will explore this ambivalence of community, of memory, and of emotion, where the competing ideologies of nationalism and national romanticism versus transnationalism, such as Scandinavism and Gothicism. That's a lot of isms, but I hope you bear with me here, came to the fore in Sweden. This presentation will attempt to nuance the perception of nationalism and Scandinavism through discussion of history construction with a focus on the emergence of antiquities associations, and in particular, the Viking heritage aspect of these antiquities associations. I will discuss how these sentiments manifested itself in elite circles in Lysekil, the coastal town of Bohuslän, as a construction and transformation of an emotional community focused on regional, national and transnational identity of Bohuslän and the larger area to which this coastal landscape belong, Viken, that sea landscape that borders on both Norway and Sweden, today's Oslo and Oslofjorden, by the way. And I will argue that all these identities are very ambivalent and not also so easily tied to specific ideologies in the construction of shared histories. So how then do I see national romanticism and emotionalism? Well, to a large extent, nationalism in the long 19th century is driven by a sense of a lost golden age. The construction of the Viking Age and the culture, traditions, values, and norms associated with it was driving force in nationalism in Sweden. But the language, both textual and image-based, that evoked the Viking Age was laden with emotional overtones. They were in abundance. And the extent to which emotionalism is important to nationalism is a growing research field. This fits very well into the leading art and literature movement of the time in the early 19th century, the Romantic nationalism. And this idea that a national people is connected through a social place and space, which itself was defined by shared ideologies of a common past, is very important for my presentation here today. And I take a great deal of inspiration from a scholar, Barbara Rosenwein. She has developed further the concept of imagined communities that Benedict Anderson introduced, and to include emotional communities instead, which is how groups are formed and maintained through emotion and the expression of emotion. Such groups then, I think, fits very well into these antiquities associations that I will talk about a little later here in today's paper. So my key points and my key concepts here is that performative nature of emotion that is directed at an audience or any receiver facilitates the construction of emotional communities and fulfills a social and socializing function to this. And emotions have a capacity to cohere social communities and drive their construction as emotional communities. You can also see, if you wish, national identities from what William Reddy, a scholar of emotions, conceptualized as an emotional regime, a set of normative emotions and official practical and emotional rituals that express and are inculated in us, a necessary foundation of any regime. Intimately tied to emotion and nationalism is also the concept of memory. Nationalism sees the future through the lens of a distorted past, trying to construct a new national belonging. And memories, or constructed memories, play a large part here. Memory studies tend to focus on a few scholars that are very, very leading in the field. Maurice Holbach's, for instance, whose work on memory forms the basis of much later research. One of my own doctoral students, now a doctor in his own right, used him quite a lot. He saw collective memory as forming from socializing and tradition, which we will see is what the Antiquities Association actually does. But we also have Pierre Nora, for me a rather confusing scholar, but he has coined a term, lieu de mémoire, sites of memory, which are not sites per se. They can be actual sites, but they can also be a concept or a practice. And I will show you later on how this fits into these antiquities associations in Lysekil. I'll give you just a small hint now. Vikarvet had annual meetings for the general public once a year in the summertime, and they called them things. Sometimes summer thing, sometimes the thing of all Bohuslänningar. And I think that I saw Alexandra Svanmark here in the list. She'll be intimately familiar with things. It is called so by the chairman in remembrance of Viking Age assemblies. And this is a traditional type of site of memory that Pierre Nora talks about quite a bit. But I'll also look at Aleida and Jan Asman that focuses on cultural memory, which is imagery, texts, and rituals that is integral to society. And through the use of memories of the past, construct and convey a sense of essence and shared knowledge. So this construction part is quite essential for me and my view of the past. This then is the three main phases that I will discuss: Gothicism, Scandinavism, and Nordism. Illustrated here by Scandinavism, 3 soldiers from the 3 Scandinavian countries, and one of the most famous paintings by Friedrich Ikander, I think, of Thor battling the giants in his cart. It is not quite visible in this particular image because it's fairly small, but on Thor's belt, this was painted in the 19th century, is a swastika. So it ties to many various forms of imagery and image concepts here. But let's go back to Gothicism first. It is a cultural movement that I think many of us associate primarily with the 19th century, with the formation of the Geatish Society of Tegnér and Geien in Sweden. I'll get to those very soon. But it actually has a rather long history in the historiography of Sweden. We can argue that it starts with a bishop in the 15th century called Nicolaus Ragnvaldi. He used the Goths to give a sense of identity to Sweden in a time, the Kalmar Union between Sweden, Norway, and Denmark from 1396 and onwards. Here he argues at a very famous speech at a church meeting in Basel on the 12th of November 1434 that, as so many diplomats do still today, that he has earned the right to sit at the foremost seat on the table next to the Pope itself, because Sweden were the descendants, we were the Geats, the descendants, and the Goths descended from us, the Goths who sacked Rome. Therefore, Sweden should have the best place at the table. Unfortunately for Nicolaus Ragnvaldi, the Spanish diplomat rose up and gave a speech saying that, well, you might be right, you might be the origin of the Goths, they left you. They crushed Rome and they founded the Visigothic kingdoms of Spain, and all that is left in Sweden are the degenerates. So we deserve the prime point. I don't remember who actually won the seat of the table. I don't think any one of them did, but it proves how history can be used for many, many purposes. Later on in Sweden in the 15th century, we also see commissions of chronicles. One of the most famous is by Erecus Olai, Chronica Regna Gothorum, the chronicle of the Gothic kings. And the brothers Johannes Magnus and Olaus Magnus in the 16th century, particularly Johannes Magnus, who gave a book called Historia de Omnibus Gothorum Sionum Gregibus, the all-out history of the kings of the Goths and the Swedes. So this whole thing really took off in the 15th century and the 16th century, the late Middle Ages and early modern for us in Sweden. This belief continued to be important, and not just for the Goths. We also sought influences from the Bible, and we used, among others, Isidorus of Seville, that famous chronicle from Spain, to prove that the Geats were direct descendants, the kings, the Geats, were direct descendants of Magog, who in turn was the grandson of Japhet, was the son of Noah. So we have origin myths in play here that shows that the Geats are direct descendants of the chosen of God, Noah, which conflicts somewhat with the idea that Odin traversed from the Black Sea to Scandinavia, and from him comes the kings of the Svea and the Goths. So origin myths are origin myths. And in the 17th century, you have to be a bit political here, Sweden became a rather large empire with holdings all around the Baltic. And for that, we also needed an interest in history. So we founded the Swedish National Heritage Board in 1666. And the likes of Johannes Bureus, Johan Hardorf, immediately started collecting information on antiquities, monuments, ancient documents, and so on. And the ultimate conclusion to all this, written by perhaps somewhat deluded scholar, was that Sweden was actually Atlantis, the lost continent, lost kingdom that Plato wrote about. And Old Uppsala was the capital of Atlantis. And the Pillars of Hercules were not the pillars on the mouth of the Mediterranean Sea towards the Atlantic, but in fact, it was in Öresund, the strait between Sweden and Denmark. The god Jupiter was none other than Thor. And I think that this idea comes directly from a chronicle from the 12th century, a German chronicle by an archbishop called Adam of Bremen, who wrote about a pagan temple in Uppsala, three gods shown there. And he makes a comparison between Roman gods such as Jupiter then, and Thor, Odin, and Frey. And this continued for a while, a bit muted, but in the late 18th century, in 1794, an aristocrat called Per Tam published his work Gothic Monuments and revived this whole issue about the origins of the Aesir and so forth, and argued that instead of Uppsala on the east coast of Sweden being the site of the kingdom, it was Västergötland, the west of Sweden, that was the cradle of the kingdom of Sweden. Not only that, according to Tam, Odin had lived in Sätuna by the lake Hornborgasjön. And, surprise, surprise, Yggdrasil, the tree of life, grew on his own estate of Dagnäs. And he really was a precursor to this whole 19th century Gothicism. And it's there we come back to what I said in the beginning, that this whole thing revived in the Romantic nationalism, with Erik Gustav Geir and Esaias Tegnér founding the Viking revival, the Geatish Society of 1811, and its journal Iduna. And this must also be placed in a political context. And Denmark had fared very poorly in the Napoleonic Wars, lost Norway in 1814, for instance. Sweden fared poorly in the war against Russia, and lost Åland and Finland in 1809. This had been a part of Sweden for over 1,000 years. A third of the area of the kingdom, a fourth of the population was lost. This really took seed in the ideas and minds of the learned of the time. And the stated purpose of this Geatish society was that every brother, they were men, all of them, were obliged to do research into the ancient Goths. They were also linked to the king. Here's what I find fascinating when it comes to the performativity aspect of this whole cultural memory ideas. They weren't called Erik Gustav Geir or Esaias Tegnér. They named themselves after Old Norse sagas. Rolf, Einar Tambarskjälve, one of my favorite heroes, Olof Trätälje, and so on. And I would say, obviously, they indulged in drinking rituals. They took out their drinking horns, decorated as Old Norse, and filled them with mead, and called them Brage's cup, after the Aesir Brage, and drank themselves, I would assume, fairly full. Scandinavism then is more of a political movement, and started out with students in Skåne and grew very much. It was very much a liberal agenda, but usually you put a deadline in 1864 when Denmark lost the Schleswig-Holstein War, the Second Schleswig-Holstein War. Sweden and Norway refused to participate in what the Swedish king, Norwegian king, had promised. They didn't participate with troops, and there the political Scandinavism came to an end. However, in later years, scholars have focused on continuity more, and Scandinavism survived as a more of a cultural movement. We have scholars such as Hannes Sanders in Lund, for instance, that does this quite a bit. And we have a scholar in Norway that has written quite a bit about this, Ruth Helmstad. She calls her thesis, and this is a translation from Norwegian, From Indian Summer to Nordic Winter, Scandinavian Cooperation, Scandinavism, and the Dissolution of the Union, which is a good thesis, but rather thick, 650 pages. So take your time with it, would be my recommendation. But this whole culture thing is what matters to me. Nordism starts roughly around the 1920s and revitalizes this whole connection between these countries, which include now then both Finland and Iceland as well. And now we'll just pop over to Lysekil and see how all this is relevant to this very, very small, well, almost like a borough or a town. It started out in the 16th century, so it was, by Swedish standards, a fairly new village/town. It started out as a fishing camp, but grew very fast into international trade. And we received the destination Köping in 1836, which means that you can trade internationally through another town. And we got privileges for being a town as rather late in its development, 1903. All this thanks to the connections between the elite in Lysekil and the crown prince and later king of Sweden. But Lysekil, in my time period that I'm investigating, is more famous for the bath period, the fashionable baths. And it didn't really start out very fashionable. You see the man and woman to the top right. It's J.G. Molén and Tanner, husband and wife. They started out by using the roughs of shipwrecks to build bathhouses in the northern port of Lysekil. And it was a rather small, scruffy bathhouses. They were much more sophisticated bath settlements around Bohuslän than this. But he was consul to several countries, so he was a powerful individual for him. Perhaps 800 inhabitants in his time, in 1851 perhaps. So it's a small settlement by all standards. And it really didn't grow in importance until 1858, 1860 roughly, when Karl Kurman came to Lysekil. He later married Kalla Kurman, a very important person. I will get to him and her later on here. Because when J.G. Molén died, his heirs started a company called Lysekil's New Bathhouse. And they gave the task to Karl Kurman, a doctor at the time, to further the development, which is what he did, which is what you also see in the top left image. You see his own house, Kurman's villas. You see it's the small one besides it. You see the honor gate that you have to pass through to get into the bath area. And you see a few buildings there that are various bath houses. And this is on the south side of Lysekil. So he moved away from the scruffiness of Molén's old bathhouse. And while Molén had perhaps 200 guests, perhaps, due to the intervention of Karl Kurman, we see that around the turn of the century, we had 2,000 bath guests every season. And this, with a settlement that had perhaps 3,000 residents. So in summertime, it almost doubled, and everyone went to these bathhouses. And Karl and Kara Kurman, they had dwellings here in the summer, but they usually live in Stockholm. So it's the high society that really lifted Lysekil. And you see on the bottom right image here, Oscar II, the King of Sweden and Norway, came and visited every summer and stayed at Kurman's villas. And this then is, to the bottom right, the main Kurman's villas. That's his dwelling. That's where he and Kalla Kurman lived. And I just love the little boat that you see down docked to his quay. It's a dragon boat. It's a remade Norwegian small boat with dragon heads, both in aft and stern, which I just find absolutely fascinating. They rowed this boat back and forth over the Gullmarsfjord, which is the water you can see here. And the portrait of Karl and Kalla Kurman is actually by Køyer, the famous Danish painter. And here you can see the very first expression of Gothicism and to a certain part Scandinavism in Lysekil. These Kurmanska villan, they were purposely built in Old Norse style by Karl Kurman. He actually drew the blueprints himself. And then there's an architect check them over and do them perhaps just a little bit better. So the big house was built in 1873, and the small house, which we can't see in this image, was built in 1878. Unfortunately, the house and quite a few of Kurman's collections and paintings and so forth burned down in 1879, and he immediately built a new one in 1880 by the same blueprints. And there were several of his acquaintances that did the same in various parts of Sweden. Axel Key, a famous professor, had his own Villa Bråvilla in Värmdö in Sweden. You have Gustav Retzius, the famous anthropologist. He had Sagantun. You had Cavallius in Sunnavik. He also had a dragon boat, by the way. And all this is usually attributed to Karl Kurman going on a trip to Norway in 1854, where he saw houses, and in particular, the famous Norwegian stave churches, which he took his cue, so to speak. He was a teacher at the Art Academy in Stockholm, member of the Artist Club, and a board member of Nordiska Museet. So he moved in all the circles where this Old Norse revival was really, really growing, the 1850s and onwards. He soon became a leading member of these associations. And importantly, he established friendship networks with, for instance, the famous Swedish painter August Malmström. Has painted quite a few beautiful paintings of Old Norse scenes. Battle of Bråvalla, for instance, if you're familiar with Viking battles. And the picture I showed you of Thorin the Giant was painted by Eskil Winge, and which was also his friend. And Hanna Winge, Eskil's wife, she was quite adept at handicraft and artwork herself. So she decorated the interior of the house. Chairs with textiles. He was an expert in textiles. There was much rune art on the inside. I'll try to show you an image of this later on. Even see if I can show you this now. This is how the inside of one of the rooms in Kurmanska villan looks. And if you look towards the right, you can see several chairs, which are obviously then supposed to be Old Norse in style. You see an image here from one in detail in the middle of one of those chairs. And in the background in this old photo, taken by Koch Kurman himself, you see a panel of friezes going around in textile. I picked one of them for you, so you can see them more clearly. You can see the Viking dragon ships with dragons, red and white sails, all the key markers of this Old Norse revival. And someone waving to these dragon ships. And that's actually Odin with his spear. And a few of you might wonder, well, if this is Old Norse revival, why on earth is the text in Latin? Sigurd at patrem vindicandum navigat. Sigurd, which is what this frieze is all about, Sigurds Fafnersbane, sails to avenge his father. Well, it's a mishmash of art, technique, style. But Karl and Kalle Kurman's home in Stockholm was built almost to a Roman Greek ideal. So this blending of styles is not so unusual at all, in fact. It is rather fascinating that it has survived to this extent here in Lysekil. I'm sorry. This whole idea also of where does this come from? Well, Karl was also a member of Idun, which is an association of ideas and culture and literature. And Kalle Kurman was instrumental and was one of the founding members of New Iduna, the foundation then for the women, because Idun was for the men. And they started having Old Norse feasts in the house in Stockholm. And they were very famous in high society for their salon. They had salon in the 1880s and 1890s, where everyone who was someone showed up. We have August Malmström, the famous painter, Oscar Montelius, Hans Hildebrand, who was the chief of the National Heritage Board. We have Sonja Kowalewski, the first female professor of mathematics, not only in Sweden, but I think in the entire world at the time. We have Björn Skjene Björnsson from Norway, the famous writer. We have many, many names. So thanks to this became then this whole focal point of the Stockholm Society when they went to the baths in summertime. And this is a map made in the 1890s, but its origin is a bit earlier. I just wanted to show you how this looks, because at the bottom you see a round small island, and towards the top of that you see a few black buildings. That's the bathhouses of Karl Kurman. And straight up almost you can see something called, I'll see if I can mark this out with my mouse key here. Here you see Lysekil's northern harbor, or the old harbor. Here's where the old bathhouses was, Jägermoléns. Down here is where the new bathhouses are, and on here on Sleggen as well. But this area here is what's important. It's called Stångehuvud. It's granite, red granite, which starts in Lysekil, by the way, and many quarries were taken there, but it was stopped by Kalle Kurman, who actually bought up the lots and donated it to Lysekil. And when you look closer to this little part of Stångehuvud, we can see several interesting names mentioned. We can see the Troll's Lair. We can see, the Black the Dark Elves Gorge, which is here. We can see Freya's Cave, which is here. We have the Dwarfs Hall, and we have here Valhall, the High Seat, which is very, very important. We also have Bredablik over here, by the way. And curiously enough, they also named one part of it Aswan, after the Egyptian fine place, and the Gates of Hercules as well. So there is a mix of Old Norse and antiquity when it comes to this, but the Old Norse is what stands out the most. And this is named in the 1880s because walking here in these cliffs were a part of the whole Bath experience, and Carl Kalakurman's fascination with the Old Norse. I haven't found any proof of this yet, but I'm fairly certain it's Carl Kurman who has named these names. But I haven't really seen it yet. Because he was a student in Uppsala and attended the very famous meeting in 1856 on Scandinavism, where Björnstjerne Björnsson was in attendance and King Oscar I was there. He actually writes a letter in 1906, and this is my rough translation. It has been 50 years since we Nordic youths on the mounds of Uppsala gave the promise and drained the mead horn together, with flaming eyes and beating hearts. I see and hear it as it was yesterday. And this then is the emotional transnationalism I'm talking about in my project. He continued the tradition of having these feasts that he had in Stockholm, in Lysekil as well. But here, the Old Norse was much more pronounced. He gave several feasts that ended up in his house in Kurman's villas. And he had a poem written that he posted outside. If you want to spare your purse and give but a crown, so come to the villas of Kurman and drench yourself with mead and pork from the pig at Valhall is also served. So you were transported into a Viking house, you were given mead, you were given pork, you were served by women, Valkyries obviously. So you actually performed the Viking age. So this whole image thing was prevalent all over. We can also see that earlier. We can see it in 1852, where they went a bit further in Gullmarsfjorden than Lysekil, which sits on the mouth of Gullmarsfjorden, to a big island called the Greater Borneo Island. There they found, lying down, standing stone, which they raised with a ceremony, because according to those who found it, it wasn't any standing stone. It was a very specific standing stone. It was the grave marker of a mythical hero called King Östen. They rose up this, they wrote a memory piece, they wrote a poem and published it in the newspaper. So Viking age, the shared heritage, communality between Sweden and Norway through Viking, everywhere we look, in poems, in journal articles, in the feasts in Lysekil, this little village settlement that isn't even a town yet by this area really celebrates the common Viking age heritage. And you can also see here, which I found absolutely fascinating. This is Kalla Kurman in the middle. She's sitting here. It's Kalla Kurman. And these women and a few men around her are the same. They were part of this network of friends that came to her and her husband's feasts. This is a bazaar in Stockholm Stock Exchange in 1885 at the Nordic Museum to raise money for the Nordic Museum. These are from the workshop of, among others, the Vinges that I mentioned previously. And we shall see a few of these images later on here as well. The precursor to this was a masquerade ball in 1869 that also used these kind of textiles. You see a harp. You see him playing here, for instance. And you see these drinking vessels all over the place. The drinking was quite important for them. But now, to get a bit more serious when it comes to the background history here, we have the Friends of Lysekil's Antiquities Association, a precursor to what I'm going to focus on fairly soon, the Vikarvet Antiquities Association. This Friends of Lysekil's Antiquities Association grew out of the Friends of Lysekil Association that was founded by Kalle and Carl Kurman in 1885. What they did was basically to grow Lysekil as a settlement. They organized the settlement. They fixed parks. They built a lookout tower, and here is where I think they did this trail that you walked in Stånghuvud, from Bredablick to Frejas Cave to the Dark Elves Gorge and to Valhall, the high seat. And later on, then in the early 1900s, they started this whole Antiquities Association, which then focused on restorations of ancient monuments, both museum. And these images here you see are the same. It's from different perspective. It's small buildings plucked together to form what they call fornhemmet. So it's like Skansen in Sweden. You have various milieus from parts of Sweden that's supposed to remind you of history. So to acquire these old buildings, fill them with the tools and clothes and other items that would be contemporary to these cabins from the 18th century and 19th century, but also gather information on customs, languages, and so forth was very important. So this whole precursor was very important, but the board and the members were not identical to those who later founded Vikarvet, which we will come to fairly shortly. But here then comes the next fascinating person into the picture, Friedrich Ikander. Born in Bohuslän, but raised in Stockholm, a poet, a writer, an actor, and he fancied himself the skald of Bohuslän, the Bohuslän poet. And I think he was the one who was most insistent on it than the others, but still. Came to Lysekil every summer, and he became the editor of a summer magazine first. But fairly soon, and he had done this in Stockholm and Uppsala as well, he started thinking about making a place at Valhall. So what kind of place would you do there? Well, obviously you do Viking place. So he did Viking place from 1912 to 1916, probably 1917. The records are iffy when it comes to that. And these plays that he did were 4 different plays. One was called the Foster Brethrens. The other was called Hammingja, after a figure from the Norse mythology. You have the Sacrificial Feast of the Aesir as the 3rd play, and you have the Judgment of the Goths as the 4th play. And at least according to Ikander and his newspaper, they were hugely successful, sold out for every performance. And as you can see here, and top picture, they had beautiful costumes, weapons and shields, and rather dramatic setting as well. And here, in more of a close-up images, you can see how beautiful they are, these textiles. And I think, I can't really prove it yet, but these then are taken from the clothes they had in Stockholm. So they were taken here and used by these actors. He calls this place My Bayreuth at the Western Sea, which is a bit interesting when it comes from a nationalistic perspective, because Bayreuth was the place where Richard Wagner had his festival, where the operas of the Nibelungenlied was performed, and where the Nazis later in the 1930s and onwards used for Nazi propaganda. And he called it My Bayreuth at the Western Sea in 1937. it's quite obvious that he knew, or at least he should have known, how this was used. Whether or not he sees these issues as his own, well, that's quite a different question. So these were the precursors to his introduction into the society circles in Lysekil at the time. And then he became friends with many of the powerful burghers in Lysekil. I just wanted to show you this image as well. If you see on the picture on the right, to the right is Friedrich Ikander. But the image to the left is also Friedrich Ikander as an actor in the play. This is Krall, the thrall, in one of the plays. So you can see that he enjoyed acting and acting as a Vikings. But he has also the serious side. He then founded Vikarvet Antiquities Association in 1915. According to Friedrich Ikander, it was he who took the initiative and founded it. Another more powerful member was James Svensson, who took over after Friedrich in 1928 and became the second chairman of the Vikarvet Antiquities Association. The first annual meeting in 1916, and this in 1917 was the first general public thing. And also then, by this time, there was a discussion of the merger of the Friends of Lysekil Antiquities Associations, which a few years afterwards happened. From 1917 to 1918, Vikarvet was alone. And they had a mission, which they stated quite clearly in its founding charter. They should do excavations, they should do restorations, they should raise memorial stones, but they should also educate. So the summer thing was for education. You had field trips, and you published a journal to disseminate the legacy of Bohuslän. So you performed the cultural heritage of these. And Friedrich, being the poetic writer as he was, he had an oath that you were supposed to take if you were to be a Vikarvet man, which you had to be until 1923, I think, when they finally allowed women to be Vikarvet women. And roughly translated, be diligent and happy, keeper of your word, honest and fair, hospitable and generous, helper of the helpless, angry with crookedness, honoring the manly virtues, defender of women virtues, counselor in woe, humble in good times, home-loving, kin-loving, knowledgeable of legends and myths, historian, sacred memory caretaker, faithful to king and country, and fearless in death. Now, I don't know how many history associations you're a member of. I'm a member of quite a few, but I can't recall anyone asking me to die for them. So I'm happy I didn't live in Fredrik's time. So through all these, you're supposed to maintain the heritage and memory of Bohuslän. And memory is used as a word and concept quite a bit in the founding charters here. And also, you had a general membership. And as I said, in 1923-24, women was also included. But you had a special category. They were called frejdare in Swedish, which roughly translated, I think, guardians. They were men and women, and they could actually be guardians from the foundation of Vikarvet in 1950. They could be guardians. They had exceptional knowledge of the history of Bohuslän and Viken. And women such as Kalla Kurman and Betta Kleberg were among the very first who was elected as guardians. Later, the son of Karl and Kalla Kurman, Professor Sigurd Kurman, the Director General of the National Heritage Board of Sweden in the 1920s and onwards, also became one of these guardians, patron, if you will, to the Vikarvet Antiquities Association. So, what did they do? Well, they honored the charter, so they did the excavations. And I think the very first one is one of the most memorable ones. In Sam in Bohuslän in 1915, an estate owned by James Svensson, seen here, Friedrich Ikander, seen here to the right in the picture. He was raised, James Svensson was raised, by the knowledge of the 40 burial mounds on the estate, and 2 of which were quite large. Took his son and walked towards them, and he told them that these 2 mounds, they had Viking ships in them. Spears, swords, helmets, battle axes, and everything. So in August 1915, an archaeologist came to excavate and told him that they are natural formations. There's nothing there. But he did find graves in the 5th century that they could excavate. And they did find cloth, brooches, buttons, pins, and so forth from a trifle of an earlier age and then the Viking age. And quite possibly the disappointment that James felt at that time made that they took a small field trip to an island just outside called Tryggön, which has a very old Bronze Age cairn on top of it. And in that cairn, they had found a Viking Age spear. And on that cairn, there they founded the Vikarvet Antiquities Association. And it comes back all the time in the Vikarvet's history. They always travel to Tryggön. It became one of the sites of memory, as Pierre Nora would have said. As for the restorations, well, back in these days, there were quite a lot of restoration work to be done. Plowing by the farmers, overgrowth, bushes, stones felled by cows, anything you can imagine had happened. So they helped with this beautiful ship setting in Blomsholm to the very north of Bohuslän, Strömstad. They raised several stones, they cleared everything, so they did a fairly magnificent job with that one. But they also took upon themselves to restore the monastery ruin of Dragsmark, which is quite close to Lysekil, quite to the east. And of course, the Tryggön cairn. Yeah, they had to repebble it, basically. But I think that what Vikarvet themselves lifts the most is this church, originally 12th century, early 12th century church in Sveneby. And this has significance because at the time, it was supposed to be one of 5 of the earliest, oldest churches in Bohuslän, with a connection to a famous Norwegian king, Tryggve Olafsson, the son, the father of Olaf Tryggvason, the king who Christianized Bohuslän. And he became a leading figure that is mentioned over and over again in Vikarvet. Again, an immaterial site of memory here. So you have a linkage, which is why they took it upon themselves to have this one. And there's actually a pamphlet produced to the inauguration of this church, where the author tries to prove that this is in fact the oldest church in Bohuslän, built by the priests of Olaf Tryggvason himself. So this would be the very first Christian sacred place, which explains Vikarvet's predilection to it. Then we had these memorial stones, basically not the work of Friedrich Ikander, but instead the work of James Svensson, who had been a part of Vikarvet since the foundation. And there is a connection between these 3 stones. They all celebrate the common heritage of Scandinavia and Scandinavism. You have here to the top left a stone in Sörbo over King Sverre, the Birkebeiner king. He was proclaimed king by the place of this stone in 1177. And the ceremony here was presided over by the governor of Oscar von Sydow and Professor Alexander Bugge from Norway, who represented the Norwegian government. So it was a mutual. They sang both songs, the national songs. They had flags and everything. So they really formed the cultural heritage. But I think that my favorite would be this one. to the far right. It celebrates the meeting of the three kings in Kungälv, to the very south of Bohuslän, and it was raised in 1940 after the invasion of Norway and Denmark and the capitulation of the Norway and Denmark to the Nazi regime. And they celebrate a peace meeting between three older medieval kings: Inge the Elder from Sweden, Magnus Barefoot from Norway, and Erik Ejegod from Denmark. They tried to make peace. They failed, but at least they tried. And James Svensson, he talked that he wanted to raise this stone as a sign of the Nordic will to unite and to community thinking. So here it's Nordism seeping into this whole thing. And it's quite fitting, perhaps, that we end this memorial stone with the memorial stone of Tryggve Olofsson, the son, the father then of Olav Tryggvason, the first king Christianized Bohuslän. So by raising these stones and returning to these stones, you do again perform and you perpetuate the memory of this emotional nationalism and transnationalism. But it's more of an elite, perhaps. And to sum it up, I will soon do that here. The final thing I wanted to discuss is the things that they also were supposed to hold according to the charter. And they held these things at a Bronze Age cairn that both Friends of Lysekil Antiquities Association and Vikarvet Antiquities Association had restored. This cairn that you see, this is my own photo, by the way, by the new church of Lysekil. And below that, you can see an image from one of these things. You see the church in a rather dim light, so to speak. And the very first thing was held in 1917. Friedrich Ikander chaired it, obviously. So he had a birch bark horn and a horn page who blew the horn to gather the followers. They raised the flag that you can see, and then he gave a speech that really emphasized the connection between the past and the present, the heathen cairn and the Christian church, as he called it. And then he talks about men of the past, the deeds and the strengths of the Northmen, oaths and patriotisms. And after his speech came lectures on Viking themes and on medieval themes. Other things had such things as the Peace of Roskilde, older churches of Bohuslän, the Gyldenlöve feud from later on and so forth, berserkers, and many of these things, songs and music. Now forgotten composer called Adrian Dahl had a song that they sang, the Vikings coming. And he said at the very end of almost every speech, you must all be knowledgeable in folk tales and traditions, never a stranger in the history of your country and your homeland. You should be one with the fates of your fathers. The descendants must know his families, otherwise he is an eternal, unworthy heir. And one of the flags flown, I come from this small village myself, had a Bronze Age sun wheel in the middle of it, taken from one of the rock carvings in Brasta, where my father and mother actually still lives. And true to the charter, they also had journals. The main journal is called Vikarvet. It's the one here. This is 1916, the very first. He published quite a few of those, and he wrote most of the texts himself. When he couldn't afford to print it, he printed a lighter version called the thing calling of Vikarvet, with the dragons and runes, very evocative of the Viking heritage. So this all they did until 1928, which is usually where I stop, because that's where Friedrich Ikander stops, under very suspicious circumstances. Someone has ripped out 10 pages in the protocol book in that year. So we really don't know what happened, but he was ousted by James Svensson. Quite interesting. And to conclude, because I know I'm getting rather long-winded here, what conclusions then what tentative conclusions then, I should say, do I draw from this? Well, I can see that these emotional identities are quite ambivalent. They do talk about themes that are Scandinavism, that are Nordistic, but they also talk much about patriotism, the fatherland, sometimes actually also the motherland. But he also talks about Vika, and he also talks about the Bohuslänningar. So there are many interesting items there. And you can absolutely see both national, transnational, and regional identities forming here. And I'm also quite fond of these performative actions that they do, that they really do use this whole thing to create emotional communities. You have the restorations, you have the excavations, you have the raising of the memorial stones, and you have the things, which is where the general public meets them. But you also have these small things, like the editor he was in Trampen, as the magazine was called, where there's almost no number that, apart from gossip, both local and national gossip, contains Viking poems, Viking stories, and so forth. So for me, these associations, you have the Friends of Lysekil Antiquities Association, and you have, of course, the Vikarvet Antiquities Associations. They are clearly emotional communities that engages in a wider emotional community by these performative actions that they do. I do see signs that can be interpreted as Pierre Norada's as sites of memories. It is quite clear that they were not merely interested in preserving the past. They were very much interested in preserving and constructing the past in the present, to influence the future in their own way, which is why we see these allusions, especially in the poems of Friedrich Ikander, where he uses this imagery of the might of Sweden today and lets us see the shadows of the Viking warriors that had gone before them and whose spirits still lived on in the seamen and the soldiers of the Swedish Navy and Army. So, emotional nationalism and emotional transnationalism as very clearly ambivalent emotional identities, which is one of the tentative conclusions that I have. And on that note, I will end the lecture part of this seminar. So I will stop sharing the screen and switch back, I think, to Andrew. Am I correct?
Yes, you are. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Thomas. Such a rich case study as well, from that, that one small town. We've got a couple of questions already in the chat from Alex, but just as a reminder to everyone, if you would like to submit a question for Thomas, you can do that on the chat function, and we'll read them out and we'll have a discussion. So Alex has posted two questions. The first is it possible to link the architecture design of Kurman's villas to specific archaeological finds or sites? Oh, I think you're on mute, Thomas.
Did I mute myself somehow?
There we go. Yeah, that's you. You're back now. That's all that's important.
In the art history documents that exists on Kurman's villas, unfortunately, fortunately from a conservation perspective, it's almost impossible to visit Kurman's villas. So I haven't been allowed inside yet. They have a few days every summer that it's open for the general public, but I live rather far away, I'm afraid, so it's not so easy to get there. But I've seen the documentation, and the current owner has graciously sent me pictures of the interior and so forth. But there is very little that can be tied to any specific place at all. In fact, the whole villa, the main villa, is basically designed almost like an IKEA furniture. It's prefabricated. So the Villa Sagantun I mentioned here is actually a copy from in the nuts and bolts from Kurman's villa itself. The interior is an entirely different question, though, and there are no actual finds. And as far as I can tell from the images I've seen, I did show you a few pieces of furniture. They are absolutely not, from any archaeological find I can think of, definitely not inspired, which I would have thought from Oseberg's ship burial and so forth. And this whole dragon motifs that are so prevalent, both in the furniture, in the textiles, and actually in the porcelain. Gustavsberg, which is a famous porcelain factory in Sweden, they did a specifically designed set with dragon motifs that the Eskil Winge and Hanna Winge did and used. But no, Alexandra, I'm afraid not any specific sites I have ever seen. I might see something when I find it out inside Kumas Villa, which I will be sooner or later.
That's interesting though of itself, though, because it suggests, you know, they're creating or inspired by something, but then creating their own kind of version of that.
Yeah, and I think that'll be one of the main things that I will press on in the project. That this is a construction of an idealized and romanticized Viking age. It's not meant to be authentic. It's meant to be a creative anachronism, basically.
Yeah. Linked into that, Alex has also posted another question. Could you tell us a bit more about the Vikarvet Thing meetings? What was the purpose? Were they recreations or real meetings?
I would say that they were real meetings. I think that he had an idea in his mind, Friedrich Ikander, of being the thing leader. I absolutely think so. When we read his poems and his biographies, he's written 3 memoirs about himself. I think he was a fairly self-absorbed person. It's very much me. And he tries to take credit for everything. So I think that he really liked to be in the spotlight. But they don't discuss matters of the Vikarvet Antiquities Association. There's an annual meeting for the board at the same time, usually the day before the thing is held. And that's where the serious business goes down. So they see the thing more as this whole the public education aspect of the founding charter, which is why he gives his speeches. He's very emotional. I love it. I mean, I've read a few of those speeches that he made. It's like he's standing on a stage, very theatrical and very pompous in his language, much about Sweden, Swedishness, patriotism, strong men, Vikings all. But then comes the lectures, and they are very professional lectures. I mean, back in these days, I mean, this is early 1900s, but also earlier on, the lectures, and they were what we historians today would call happy amateurs. I mean, there were priests that researched, laymen that did excavations. Not unusual at all for farmers to be given permissions to dig, but they talk about everything. I mean, I've read a few of them. They're actually not that bad. They talk about knights' romances. There's a very famous story of Axel and Valborg. They talk about the nature of Bohuslän, the place names, origins, the monastery itself and the foundations and so forth. But there's also the singing, which is very patriotic. The Vikings are coming, and they sing the national anthem. And Friedrich himself very, very commonly recites his poems on and on and on. I've started buying up his poetry collection. He's published like I think 67 variants, quite a few. Northman Mind, poems about ancient past and present. I Love My Country, it's another poem collection. And Swedish Shadows, historical poems, is the third. Those are the ones that I, for now, find the most interesting. So not an assembly that can influence the work of Vikarvet, absolutely not, but more of a public education aspect of the thing.
And do you have any idea about attendance? If the idea is public education, how many? The photo you showed seemed to show quite a lot of people attending.
I think they were. I mean, I've seen photos of his Viking plays as well, and I mean, he boasts about them being sold out and so forth. But
Right.
what I can see, I mean, the Viking plays were at least 100, 150 guests in attendance. They were only given 2 or 3 times every summer, so that might explain it. The things were held once every year, and I've seen a few other images, and a few of them are actually more packed than the one I showed you here. So I would say anywhere between 50 and 100 participants. And judging by the clothes, they do represent a rather large section of Lysekil, not just an educated elite, but well, standard people like you and me,
Yeah.
basically.
It's a bigger crowd than I've ever got, so he was obviously doing something right.
Yeah.
Steve's asked the question which I was thinking about as well. He says, thank you very much for the talk. And there's also been thanks from Alex and Bodil. But Steve's asked, have you looked at similar neo-romantic movements, say, in Scotland and Germany for comparison?
Not yet. I've read literature that speaks of this, because medievalism is a rather growing field, and medievalism fits into this. So I've read a bit about this whole English uh, movement in the Victorian era, for instance, and so
Yeah.
forth. Not so much about the Scottish yet. I mean, I know about the Ossians, the songs of Ossian, for instance, which has a large impact in both Germany and Scandinavia. And I've started reading up on this whole German nationalist gathering phase in the 19th century that drew heavily upon English examples, for instance, because they wanted to shy away from the French example.
Yeah.
But I haven't really looked at these associations just yet, because for the moment I'm focusing on the regional aspect and not this whole national aspect. I haven't really found any comparative associations just yet. There are many antiquities associations forming in Sweden, at least in this time, but they tend to be more national than regional. And when it comes to the regional aspects, you have what is called hembygdsföreningar, but those are, well, more than happy and glad amateurs. I mean, if you go to one of those today, you usually see farmers' tools, equipment, and windmills and so forth. This Vikarvet and the Friends of Lysekil, they are much broader, much denser, and much more supported by the National Heritage Board and so forth, for instance.
Mhm.
I imagine that the further I read upon this, and the further I read about the Hemsö, for instance, I might take a broader outlook than merely look at Scandinavia. That's what
Yeah,
I
I
meant.
mean, you've already answered kind of what was going to be my follow-on to that, because the case study that you presented is so rich but so locally focused.
Mhm.
It's quite clear that it's about revitalizing Norse heritage and culture in that area.
Yep.
Um, and yet, from the photos that you showed, there was definitely some Wagnerian kind
Yeah.
of visual influences creeping in. So it'd be interesting to see, the extent of that. I mean, I think I spotted a couple winged helmets in one of the photos.
Yeah.
And obviously, Wagner's at that exact time as well, and the German kind of revitalization's happening. So it'd be really interesting to see if there was that kind of cross-contamination almost.
I would say that there is, because I didn't mention this in the presentation here, but he's ousted in 1928, and I have a suspicion that the open answer to this is there was a dispute between him and the other board members about raising a memorial stone to a philosopher called Thomas Thorild, because he wanted to do it earlier, he claims, in the shape of a standing stone. The other members thought it was wrong because Thomas Thorild isn't about the Viking Age at all, so they wanted more of a square stone. And apparently, this dispute was enough to oust him as the chairman. I doubt it,
Mhm.
because I've found both in his writings previously to 1927, but also in archives, that his Swedishness and patriotism is dangerously close to liking fascism. And he gives speeches at fascist meetings in 1927. And he publishes in 1934 a poetry collection called Race and the Kingdom. And when you read that, it's, well, it's 1934. I can't be much clearer than that. I'm saving that for a later paper, basically. But I think that they knew about this. They were not pleased with his predilections for fascism, if that's what it was. Because in those days, from 1925 to 1935, there are plenty of associations starting in Sweden that makes it very difficult to see whether it's about patriotism and Swedishness or whether it's patriotism and fascism.
Mm-hmm.
And many of these associations has members that you can define as either or both.
Mm-hmm.
So if you move in that gray area there, you might not be a fascist or a Nazist, but you definitely are in those circles. And I think that's more likely a reason why he was ousted than over the shape of a memorial stone.
It sounds convincing anyway. Yeah, and again, I guess that would be a local, or sorry, that would be an interesting example of that local versus national dynamic and how that's playing out.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. We do have time for another quick question if anyone is typing away. I'll just give people a second in case anyone is mid type. So what's the plans for this, Thomas, in terms of taking this forward? Obviously, with the project.
Yeah, I will apply for funding. Due to exigencies beyond my control, I didn't make it this year. If everything goes well, I'll continue writing on it on the application here during the fall, because our applications for the 2 large funds is in the spring of 2023, and it's quite possible that I'll talk to a fairly recent doctor in history in Gothenburg, if he wants to participate in this project and take as a post. I've known him for a while, so if he needs that as a support to stay in the community, I will offer him to be a part of this project. If not, I'll apply myself to one of these funds, because this is something I want to write about.
Yeah.
And I have the foundation for one article even now, because it's always better to have one of those when you apply for funds as well.
Yeah, brilliant. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, thank you.
It's a great project. I'd love to see and hear more about it.
Mm-hmm.
We've got a great question to finish up on from Lynn. She says it's not comparable really, but do you see any parallel with the modern rise in the Marvel universe with Thor et al. In terms of, I guess, the revitalization of the of Norse heritage?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this whole popular culture thing, which is something scholars have figured out fairly recently, was a thing back then as well. I mean, just this whole image of the historical paintings, the stories. Friedrich Ikander wrote a 3-volume, what he called a history of Ranrike, which was one of the names of Bohuslän at the time. It's legends and myths just crushed into one. I mean, he spins a very convincing yarn, and it's fabulous reading, but it's nowhere close to the truth. And the Marvel universe, where all of a sudden Thor isn't a god, it's a power that can be transferred to anyone who then becomes Thor, which is what we'll see in the next movie. We'll see Jane Foster as Thor. So they redo the Viking Age. I mean, this is medievalism. I mean, it's absolute forte. And I think you can use that term, medievalism, and see that what they do to the Aesir and the history of Bohuslän by Friedrich Ikander and Karl and Kalle Kurman, it's the same mechanisms. It expresses itself differently, obviously, because we don't use the same lingo, but it's absolutely the same.
Brilliant. I think that's probably a great point to wrap up on. But before I bring matters to an end, can I just ask everyone to join me in the traditional awkward virtual round of applause for Thomas for a fantastic paper. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, Thomas.
Well, thank you, Andrew, and thank you to you participants and your questions as well.
And all that's left for me to do is to warmly invite everyone back to our next seminar in our schedule, which will be from our very own Professor Mairead McCraith, who will be speaking at an earlier lunchtime slot on 1 p.m. on the 11th of May on the topic of the Convention of the Protection of the Intangible Cultural Heritage, Resistance, Challenge and Opportunity, which I think there'll be some overlap actually in terms of topics, and that should be brilliant as well. But until then, thank you again everyone for attending tonight. Thank you again to Thomas for giving the fantastic paper, and we'll see you all again next month. Enjoy the rest of your evening and good night.
All right. Thank you, Andrew. It was fun.
Thank you, Thomas.
So have